podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to the Dunbar End podcast, that audio-visual segment from the Hibs Observer that seeks to entertain you on a Wednesday night and hopefully inform you too. I'm Jack Harris, and as ever, the lights have gone out and I'm joined by Hibs Observer editor Patrick McPartlin. Patrick, the lights look a lot better than they do here with you, and you've got a much nicer background than the shoe rack that we see behind me. How are you doing?
I'm well lit for a start, which is, I think, a bonus at this time. I'm good. Yeah, I think there's been a lot to digest from Saturday's performance against St Mirren and the result, and of course going into a big game on Sunday against Celtic at Celtic Park. Plenty to talk about there. I think much of which we're going to cover in tonight's pod. So I think, yeah, several topics to discuss, several interesting points to look at, and hopefully a very quick 30 minutes or so as we talk about the latest developments in this Hibs team.
Absolutely. Like you say, a very big game on the horizon. Hibs travel to Celtic Park on Sunday, hoping to keep the race for fourth place and potentially above alive. 3 points there is very much needed, very much wanted, but it will be a tough game to beat the champions. Although, as we'll discuss, I'm sure they've not looked fantastic in recent games and somehow ground out results and got the job done. Before we move on to that, though, Patrick, I want to talk about a little news story that's been doing the rounds today, maybe yesterday as well. I lose track of exactly when we found out this information, but I know you wrote for the Hibs Observer today. You were talking about Ante Suto and the deliberation he now has on his hands with the World Cup not too far away between representing Croatia and representing Australia. So I thought I'd ask you first just to talk about what you were saying in the article. What is the story and what is the decision he has to make?
Yeah, well, I think to start with, it's to do with his international allegiance. We know he was born in Croatia, came from a Croatian team. He's got an extremely Croatian-sounding name, but when Hibs signed him and they announced him, there was a lot of reference to him being sort of like Croatian-Australian. And I think since then, there's been a lot of interest, shall we say, from Australia into how exactly he qualifies for the Socceroos, if he'd be able to, sort of if the paperwork could get sorted in time for him to be an option. Because I think, I don't think Australia are really blessed with a lot of centre forwards in his style. They've got, we've got players like, I'm just gone a complete blank there. Players like, the Toure brothers, you've got Nestoria and Kunda, players who are very sort of similar in sort of the style that they play. They don't really have a kind of target man type figure in the mold of Suto. And I think that could be an interesting one for them to explore. And I think Suto was speaking to the Evening News, and he was explaining that his dad was actually born in Melbourne and lived in Australia for I think it was about 20 years, and then moved to Croatia permanently. I think when he met his now wife and Suto's mum. So that's how he qualifies. So it is very it's very close. It's not one of those things where it's sort of scrabbling around for a grandparent who qualifies for certain countries, like we've seen with Scotland sometimes. But it's a really interesting one, I think, for me, because you've got a player who is very keen to represent Australia, is very sort of close connections with the country. He's got a lot of cousins there. Obviously, the Australian coach at the moment, Tony Popovic, very similar, born into a sort of Croatian family. And I just think, it's the World Cup on the horizon. It's, what are we at, 4 months out? Something like that. It's going to be a really interesting kind of second half to the season for Suto, because if he has that kind of carrot, if you like, of getting into the Australia squad, Popovic has shown that, he will give players a chance to, get into the squad. I think there's maybe a feeling that certain elements of the squad are kind of at the older end of the spectrum. I would include Martin Boyle in that. I think is 32, if I'm right in thinking. And especially with the forward line, they're trying to sort of blood some younger players in there as well. And Suto at I want to say 25. I think that's right.
Really should have 25, yeah.
He's got a few years ahead of him. There's friendlies coming up next month against Cameroon and Curacao. So I think that's a possible route in for him if he keeps sort of doing what he's been doing for Hibs, which is coming on the pitch and scoring goals. Then, if they can get the paperwork sorted in time, then I think you would look at the March friendlies as a possibility, or a chance, if you like, for Popovich to have a look at what to do and then make a decision about the World Cup squad. It'd be obviously great for Suto to get to the World Cup. It'd be great for Hibs to be able to say to future signings, prospective signings, look, if you come to Hibs, you can you can basically get a route into international football. It's happened for countless players. I'm not going to sit here and list them all, but there certainly have been a lot of players who have either had their international careers revived by coming to Hibs or have started an international career, not necessarily for the country you might expect. We had things like Dylan Vente when he was at Hibs, represented Suriname. Martin Boyle in Australia is the obvious one. Rocky Bashiri in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is all sort of like what playing for Hibs can get you, and I imagine that will have been one of the selling points for Ante Suto when Hibs were in talks with him. It was saying, look, you want to get into the Australian squad. If you come here, then you're on a platform where a lot of players are getting kind of noticed by the Australian setup. They are getting into the squad, and especially if you look at the numbers of Hibs and Hearts players over the past few seasons who've been in and around the Australia squad, even from Hibs alone, obviously Nectar Triantis, Jack Iredale, sort of thereabouts. And Triantis is obviously now declared for Greece. You've got Martin Boyle, you had Lewis Miller. Before them, you had Jamie McLaren, Mark Milligan, and there's been plenty across the other side of the city as well, and still a couple who I would say harbour hopes of getting into the squad. So a really interesting one to keep an eye out for, and I think potentially good news for Hibs if they've got somebody who is hell bent on getting into the Australia World Cup squad, and to do that, he needs to show that he can score goals, needs to show that he can, probably do more than just score goals. And I think it will be an interesting few months just seeing how Suto kind of copes with that kind of dangling in front of him, because it's a heck of a sort of carrot to have. It's a heck of a goal to have, and it's one of those where I think all parties are going to benefit from that.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a great carrot to have, and when he's in this form, was it 3 games and 2 goals from that, then that's something to really kick on with through the rest of the season. I'm sure we'll catch where Suto plays a role in the coming months later on. But yeah, it does feel like the Australia squad is the better solution, at least in terms of, you picked up on Australia not really having that many recognised centre forwards. On the flip side, if you look at Croatia, my governing memory of the Croatian national team is the 2018 World Cup final, and obviously with the likes of Mario Mandzukic, they have some other players coming through like Kramaric, Tony Fruk, Osasuna's Ante Budimir. I know he's not had that many international minutes. I think he had maybe at least a friendly recently, but one of those just kind of out and out number 9s does the same sort of thing that Suto does, especially at club level, just sort of finds himself in the right position to score goals. So there's a lot of competition to get into that Croatia squad, and it's a Croatia squad that over sort of recent history has really gone above and beyond. It's reaching exactly that, World Cup finals, the latter stages of European championships as well. It's obviously a fantastic nation to represent, but with that comes the caveat of how long is it going to take to burst your way into that side. And in this way, there's also the fact that, like you say, the Australia scouts and Popovich himself, they're looking at Easter Road already, because they have obviously the internationals who come through, but also players representing to this level still there at the minute. And I think Jack Iredale is going to be one of those players that's really making a good claim to work his way into that Australia squad. Obviously, I think getting a first cap, or at least a first call-up, if I remember correctly, quite recently. He's always said that that's a big aspiration to represent Australia. So no doubt the eyes of the Australian national team and the Socceroos will be on Easter Road. So it's the right place for Suto if he continues to burst into there. Obviously, we had the quite difficult news either yesterday or today that Lewis Miller will miss out on the World Cup. I know you wrote a little bit about that as a very a very tough moment for Lewis, and I think we'd both sort of want to send our best to him. It's heartbreaking to see a young player, or a relatively young player, miss out with the World Cup just around the corner, especially given how well he played in the latter stages for Hibs. And I've not kept a close eye on him down south, but he'll definitely have wanted to be a part of that squad, and that's a very tough thing for him.
It is, yeah, and I think a lot of people could probably see his potential when he was at Hibs. A bit of a slow start with injuries and little niggles here and there, but I think once he sort of became a kind of more first team regular under probably David Gray, I think just in that initially that right wing back slot, then right centre back, he was just such a sort of positive profile to have, because he could play. He's a dual position player. We know that David Gray values that in the members of his squad. And it was certainly talked about over the summer. It was talked about the losing Nectar Triantis from the midfield would be a big blow, losing Dwight Gale from the forward line would be a big blow, losing Nikola Kurevic from the front line would be a big blow, just in terms of having somebody to kind of ease the burden on Kieran Bowie. And it's almost as if not as much was made about Miller going. I think understandably he would attract interest from the English Championship just for his performances for Hibs. It was quite clear that he'd kind of moved up from when he first came into the club. You could see that development, you could see that maturity, you could see that he was probably destined to go up a level at least. And he's been playing regularly for Blackburn, not having a fantastic season themselves by all accounts based on league position, but it's when you've got a World Cup on the horizon, and you think Lewis Miller's another one who he'd played quite a lot of games for Australia at youth level. I think in fact he was late in joining Hibs when he signed, because he'd been playing, I think, in the under 23. I think it was the under 23 Asian Cup, and it's obviously something that he was keen to do. But I think just that sort of uncertainty about maybe his best position, and that kind of trust in can he go up against sort of very very skillful forwards or wingers, and can he kind of keep them quiet? Can he snuff them out? And I think, the more he did that for Hibs, and the more he showed his versatility. Australia currently play a very similar setup to Hibs with the wing backs and the, sort of different types of centre backs, and they're very fluid, very kind of flexible. And I think Miller really suited that. And I think for a lot of players to be so close to something that's probably for a lot of footballers is the ultimate dream, is to represent your country at a World Cup. It's a hammer blow for him, and a real tough one for him to take. An anterior cruciate ligament injury, never sort of like the easiest news to get, as well, with the recovery time and how that affects you sort of mentally as well as obviously physically. So true Millsy style. I saw him on social media saying that I think it was something like, "You better believe I'll be back stronger," and I have absolutely no doubts that'll be the case. But you mentioned Jack Iredale there, and it does possibly, Miller's misfortune may open the door a little wider for Iredale if Popovic, decides to kind of rejig his backline, rejig his defensive options. Obviously, I think Iredale has a lot to do to kind of really give Popovic something to think about. But as you wrote about earlier this week, and as we've seen in the last sort of few games, he does seem to be coming back to something resembling his sort of best form for Hibs. So, that's an interesting one to watch, I think, as well, just in the background. I think he's, out of all the players who played for Hibs and have got the Australia call-up, I think, Iredale's maybe been the one that he's been sort of thereabouts. He's on the fringes. He's, kind of almost there. So, you'd have to imagine it would be, injuries or lack of form for, other players to give him a sort of more of a chance of getting in. But, he'll have to be looking at something like this as a potential opportunity, as rough as it might be, with a former teammate.
Yeah, and you bring Jack Iredale in there very nicely, because we've got a couple of people talking in the live chat about the combination of Nicky Cadden and Jack Iredale, and whether or not Jordan Abita sees any game time at the weekend. So I think maybe something we can look at now. As you said, I wrote about how interesting I thought Jack Iredale was and has been this season. He has had I don't want to say a bad start to the season, but just wasn't looking quite the player that he looked in 2024-25. And I spoke a little bit about the rotation of different defensive parts that have been moving around him. And this combination of Nicky Cadden and Jack Iredale against St Mirren worked very well. And I think Patrick, you and I both hypothesized on the forward combinations of the game at Celtic Park, but I think that relationship is equally important. And when you look at the Kilmarnock game against Celtic comes to mind, that actually being able to hit them on the left hand side, as Kilmarnock were able to do so fantastically well through Tyrese John-Jules, and that whole sort of left avenue gave them so much space to work with. I saw something quite similar with the way that Hibs played. I mean, admittedly, it's Hibs versus St Mirren, not only St Mirren, but a struggling St Mirren side who've not looked great for form, are in a bit of a slump, and were playing on the road. But you could see elements of what Kilmarnock did so successfully and what Hibs were able to do, admittedly, at a different level. And I think for me, J-Star L8M, I think I completely agree that Jordan Abita has earned the right to play. And I think when Jordan Abita has played so far this season, looked exactly what we expect from Jordan Abita, Nicky has earned the right to that as well. I think both of them, good catch. I think both of them have earned the right to play in different ways. But I think when you have the combination of Nicky Cadden and Jack Iredale, you do get a very proactive attacking outlet. And I think going to Celtic Park, I mean, Patrick, maybe you'll disagree with me, but from my perspective of watching Hibs the last time they went to Parkhead, there was a reticence to sort of take the game by the scruff of the neck and really go to try and get 3 points. I mean, I don't want to say it's go along and get a point, but there did look some sort of reticence to really go and attack. And I think when teams have beaten Celtic or have got points against Celtic, or even, I mean, this incredible spate of late winners they seem to be having, I mean, it can't last forever, can it? Insert the Mick McCarthy meme, it can. But that you do need to look at a team that has struggled in some ways, even playing at home, and think, if Hibs go and choose to be proactive, particularly with the forwards and moving forward through the pitch, then there are rewards to be reaped there. I'm not sure if that's something you would see, Patrick. I'm sorry, I haven't quite read your half of the picking the attack and dissecting that yet. But how do you see?
Noted.
I was expecting it earlier this morning. I haven't had time this afternoon. But yeah, I mean, talk us through your thoughts in terms of attack, and how does that build throughout the pitch, as much as with, I think you also went with the front two. How much does that build throughout the pitch?
Yeah, I mean, just to take the kind of the left hand side option. I mean, I think it's one of those things where I think when you look at the players who can play out there, so you've got Nicky Cadden, you've got Jordan Abita, you've got Jack Iredale. Obviously, I mean, Jordan Abita is really the only one we've seen playing the left wing back role and the left centre back role, and it's one of those things where, you know, you can see why Hibs were quite keen to bring in another centre back in January after Zach Mitchell went back to Charlton, just because it's one thing having dual position players, but I don't think you want to be relying on a dual position player's kind of secondary position as, you know, kind of covering your squad. So I think you want to have a situation where you maybe have players who can operate in, you know, they've got maybe one main position, they've maybe got a secondary position, and then there's a third tertiary position that they could play in an emergency. So, for example, you know, I think you look at Jamie McGrath and you look at him playing, you know, just behind the front two. He can play as, you know, kind of sitting a bit deeper in midfield. And then his third position would probably be going out to left wing back, which he had to do in December due to a kind of lack of availability of anyone else who could play there. Nicky Cadden's obviously had such a stop-start season with injuries. He's kind of had his little niggles and knocks. He's come back. He's, you know, exacerbated it, or he's kind of picked something else up. And I think, you know, really good for him to get more minutes under his belt against St Mirren. I think that'll be really good for him going forward. And I think, you know, we're talking about the attack, and I think my sort of choice for like who I would play up front is kind of based on having that sort of dual threat from the left of Nicky Cadden and Jack Iredale both kind of getting forward and putting crosses in. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that Celtic are probably going to be a bit more proactive than St Mirren were when it comes to trying to prevent Hibs from playing. So that comes into it as well. I think when we see Hibs go to Celtic Park, they do tend to play with more of a back five rather than the back three. Obviously, it's very fluid; it can change, but that's when I think you really are relying on the likes of Nicky Cadden just to sort of make things happen a bit more. You're also probably looking for Jamie McGrath, who likes to drift out to that sort of left hand side to kind of get a bit involved. And we've seen the forwards get involved as well. We've seen forwards kind of pull out to the flanks as well, just to create that bit of space. So I mean, if Abita's fit, it is a big if. You'd be throwing him straight in after being out for a bit, and it's a big ask to be doing it against Celtic, especially when you don't need to. David Gray, one of his favourite kind of terms is that the team that starts is never the team that finishes, and we'll talk about that with relation to the striking options. But I think if you've got a bench of players who would be nobody would sort of raise their eyebrows if they started, that's ultimately I think what David Gray wants to have. And it's, just having those bodies so that you can say, well, I'm going to start X, Y, and Z, and then I can bring A, B, and C off the bench. But then it's just being able to mix that up. So for me, I think you try, well, you change a winning team as little as you can. I think you only make changes if you absolutely have to, or if tactically it makes sense. Which brings me neatly into my next point, which is my sort of striking partnership, if you like, for this game. I would go Dane Scarlett and Ante Suto for the simple reason. I know.
Interesting.
But the simple reason that both of them are kind of physical strikers, but they have slightly different profiles. So we've seen with Dane Scarlett, since he's coming to the Hibs team, that he does have that tendency to kind of drop deep, to go and pick balls up a bit deeper and make things happen. The ball also sticks to him like Velcro, which is useful from those sort of Rafael Salinger kickouts as well. And I just think that if you look at, I mean, I know it's not Celtic Park, it's Hampden, but if you look at the League Cup final and St Mirren beat Celtic 3-1, they started with two centre forwards. They started a 3-5-2, a flat five in midfield, and two sort of physical strikers in Dan Lundalu and Jonah Ayunga. And Ayunga scored two. It was, it worked. It worked a treat against a defence that's probably not going to be too dissimilar from the one Hibs will be facing on Sunday. And I think that if you think about the games that Dane Scarlett's played in, he's played in the Champions League, he's played for Tottenham in Premier League games. Ante Suto's probably played in a few pretty hostile environments in Croatia. And, those are players who, be used to the noise, who be used to the big occasion, possibly more so than somebody like Owen Elding, and maybe a little bit harsh to take him out of the team after his goal and performance last week. But I also think that David Gray is the kind of person, the kind of manager who maybe feels he has a duty of care to players and doesn't want to put undue pressure on them, and just sort of let them kind of grow into being at the club on their own terms. I think we've probably seen some players who've been like, probably a little bit too much has been asked of them too soon. And I think, if you consider that he came on against Rangers as a sub and, looked quite bright, he was then an unused sub for the next two games. He's then handed a start. I think it's just that it's kind of drip feeding him into the squad at the moment and, almost, I suppose, sort of giving him a chance to say, this is the Scottish Premiership. This is what it's like. You can get used to it. Because, remembering that he didn't play for a while. He was back in pre-season with Sligo Rovers before he signed, but he had been in the off-season a little bit, which is maybe another reason why they're just kind of managing his minutes a little bit. I don't think, I know that if you're, good enough, you're old enough type thing. I know people start talking about Jimmy Rourke and how young he was when he started playing and things like that. But I think possibly David Gray wouldn't be sort of thinking about starting Elding at Celtic Park just because of the occasion, because of the defenders. With the greatest of respect to St Mirren, it's a bit different facing the Buddies at Easter Road than it is facing Celtic at Celtic Park. It's obviously not showing too much respect to Celtic, but I think it's recognising that it probably is a step up, and it maybe even works in the players' favour and in David Gray's favour and in Hibs' favour if they happen to come off the bench and he's keen to make a point and say, well, hold on a minute. I started the last game. I scored a goal. I could have had more. I didn't let myself down. I put in a good showing. I should have started this game, because you want that level of competition in your squad. You obviously want competition for places. You want the squad to be tight knit, but you also do want there to be that little bit of needle. With players thinking, "Now, hang on a minute. Like I'm good enough to start, and I should have started this game. So I'm going to do extra on the training pitch. I'm going to do extra in the gym. Whatever, to sort of really kind of ramp up that competition." So yeah, for me, I think Scarlett and Shuto, you can look at Shuto and say, 2 goals in 3 games. I mean, what is it, 83 minutes combined across 3 appearances? He's somebody who knows where the goal is. I've lost count of the number of times that I've seen Hibs strikers at Celtic Park just pass up really good opportunities. I've seen Hibs strikers score at Celtic Park, not as many as they would like, not as many as the management team would like. But I think back to probably the 0-0 draw earlier this season. I think back to the Scottish Cup quarter-final last season. And, Hibs were just a little bit toothless in attack. And I think there maybe has to be a kind of happy medium between not kind of going so hell for leather that you sort of leave yourself open to a heavy defeat, but also, recognizing that, Celtic, they do have frailties, they can be got at. And there are other teams who, as we've seen, have shown that it is possible to beat them. You talk about their habit of scoring last minute winners and the fact that that's got to end soon. You could equally look at the last time Hibs won in Glasgow against Celtic in 2010 and say, well, that run's got to end sometime soon as well. I think they have a really good opportunity this weekend. Back on the strikers, no matter who you start with, you're going to have a lot of options on the bench, to come off that sort of 60, 65-minute mark. I'd be happy with Martin Boyle staying on the bench. I think, just as I say that, it's been brought up. Yeah, I mean, we've seen David Gray drop Martin Boyle before when he's maybe not quite on top of his game, and I think it's fair enough. I think Boyle has, he's had a lot of expectation on his shoulders for quite some time, a sort of talismanic figure. Fact, he's been wearing the captain's armband for a lot of this season. Strikers will go through these little droughts. He still does have that ability to, to score goals, to make things happen. But, we saw last season he was given a spell out of the team and he came back and he was like a new player. It was like, Boyle rejuvenated. And yeah, I can see the argument for bringing him back in for a trip to Celtic. I really can. It feels like a very David Gray thing to do. Here's a player who, has played against Celtic, has beaten Celtic, has scored against Celtic at Celtic Park as well. He knows what's expected. He knows how difficult it can be. And, he's somebody who can, probably talk the other players through it, tell them what to expect. But, you have to go with your strongest squad. You have to go with, I think, your form players. And I think for me, I know he's not scored yet, but he has come close. And I think Dane Scarlett, he's been consistently good in his appearances so far. That sort of focal point up front, very good in the air, not afraid of a physical battle. And, like you say, that ability to kind of drop deep. So if, Hibs are going sort of, it's a 5-4-1, for instance, out of possession, then that allows him to kind of drop back and play that kind of, play the sort of tip of the diamond with Shuto up front. And then Shuto, like we said, 2 goals in 3 games in 83 minutes. I think he's probably earned himself a start just to see what he can do. And I think having 2 strikers who are totally different to what Celtic have faced before, there's maybe that element of surprise. I know with, all the software and technology that, it's not going to be a surprise in the sense that it might have been once upon a time when you would sign a player and put him in on the morning of the game and the opposition had no idea who he was or what his strengths were. But, you look at the rest of the bench, you've got Ellie Yuan to bring on as well. You've got, Elding who can come on, probably keen to, to try and prove a point. So it's, David Gray calls it a nice headache to have. It sounds like a cliche, but it's accurate. It's true. Having options who you can start with and options to bring off the bench just to kind of, keep it going. And depending on how the game pans out, you might need the strikers off the bench more than you need the ones who start, or it could be the other way around. But I think the one thing I would like to see is I'd like to see Hibs sort of properly kind of go for it, not by being sort of like gung ho or by being careless, but just not being sort of too timid and not being too sort of well, a point's a good result. When you look, Celtic are not, they've improved. They made some signings in the January window, but I think they are still beatable. I think there are Hibs sides that probably haven't been on paper as good as this one, who've gone to Celtic Park and have got wins, but have also taken points as well against better Celtic teams. So I think you look at that and it's not entirely out with the realms of possibility that Hibs can bring that run to an end, but only I think only if everyone's kind of at it, if they're on top of their game, and if the right decision is made in terms of the strikers from start and off the bench.
Yeah, and one thing you said. Well, that sounds harsh. One thing you said was really valuable. Everything you said, Patrick, was really valuable. But one thing in particular, I'm hearing worse on Twitter at the moment. What I find really interesting about that is what you say about Needle. And I think when you look at the Hibs bench at the moment, most of the forward players will think that they have a claim to stake to start at Celtic Park. And I think that's perhaps not something you've always been able to say, but you look at the likes of, Ellie Yuan's having a really good run of form. I keep saying he's having a really good run of form recently. He's obviously not been so much of an influential character since the new signings have come in, but you have to look and say that on his day, Ellie Yuan can change a game. So there'll be at least a sort of stake to coming off the bench. Martin Boyle forever is one of those players that can find goals at critical times. I think back to the game at Celtic Park, the last time Hibs were there, and I seem to remember he had a pretty good opportunity to score. It's just like Celtic are not going to continue to score all of these late goals. Martin Boyle is not. He has been wasteful recently, but patches. Form comes for forwards in patches. Now, my reasoning behind picking Owen Elding and Dane Scarlett, and whilst I take completely your point that it is unlikely that David Gray will throw someone into the bullpen of Celtic Park when A, they've just joined, B, they're 19, and C, haven't had the most match sharpness, I think it's fair to say. But my reasoning was, we're looking at a Celtic team that will have played in the Europa League on tomorrow, I think, against Stuttgart at Celtic Park. So we go back to the theme of last season when Hibs beat Celtic at Easter Road 2-1 and does this sort of alien concept of the European hangover exist. Well, I think to a degree, you have to look at two centre-backs who haven't been rotated all that much so far this season by Martin O'Neill. Through my knowledge of the squad depth at Celtic is not 100%, but they didn't do too much business, and you think there is some necessity that Austin Trusty and Liam Scales are playing. Obviously, Cameron Carter-Vickers out injured. Then you're looking at two centre backs who've played a lot of football already, are going to play a tough game on Thursday, sort of not quite winner takes all, but an important knockout game at least. Then having somebody like Elding, who I thought ran really well, made good runs, and I think what I tried to express in my piece and maybe didn't do brilliantly, but there's a good connection that those two have formed already. And what I saw in Elding from the press box was a player who's very headstrong, who is able to express himself both through his football as well as vocally. And I think having that understanding between the two of them would be brilliant to start with. Then I would be looking to the likes of Ante Suto to come on later on. That's not just because in my SPFL fantasy team I do have him as a super sub, and it's really doing me wonders at the minute. He does seem like he scores every time he comes off the bench. But I think somebody mentioned as well the connection between Warren Ahora and Felix Paslak, and how actually, the goal does come. There we go. It's right there. I'm getting used to this system. It's fantastic. The goal does come from the right hand side. I think it's from a Barlaser cross in, but as that connection begins to strengthen in the same way that Nicky Cadden and Jack Iredale does, then we have good threat coming into the box. I mean, Celtic do have two centre backs who, on paper at least, should be good at clearing crosses in. But having somebody that can run at them, having Scarlett, like you say, the ball sticks like Velcro, and he's able to move it forward and sort of pick out teammates, go a little bit further back. You have a variety of options, and then as that tiredness begins to set in, I think throw Ante Suto on, and we'll see how long the Ante Suto effect lasts for. But that is all to be ruminated upon throughout the next couple of days. And we will be providing coverage in the build-up to the game and also after the game itself from press conferences. Patrick, you will be at HTC tomorrow to speak to David Gray and not one but two players. So we'll get your insight after that, and then we will see you all after the game. Thank you again for joining us here live on YouTube. Thank you for all of your support so far on social media, on YouTube as well. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. It does help us a lot. And share with any interested Hibies who might be keen to join our community and engage with our work on the app, as well as online social media and here on YouTube. We'll be back next week with our podcast, but we will see you on Sunday with a lot of content from what should be and can be a very exciting game for Hibs. All the best. Enjoy the rest of your week, and we will see you then. That's bye for now.